Good afternoon, ladies, and welcome to Target Elevate. Namaskara, also from Bangalore. I'm Dr. Gorur Shrinivas, and I lead data engineering at Target. Today, we bring you a masterclass that addresses the most basic thing humans do countless times over in a day, making a choice. Very often, we are not even aware that we are making a choice when we do so. From the simplest things like choosing what to wear for the day, what to eat, what to read, we don't really think about why we are choosing what we do. And sometimes we make our choices in a split second. Shedding light on this seemingly ordinary task today is an expert on the art of choosing. From growing up in the United States as a visually challenged Indian American to an accomplished academic and a much sought after TED speaker, Professor Sheena Iyengar has been helping millions of people and companies look beyond the simplicity of this exercise. That is, to make the right choice. For the next 45 minutes, we have an amazing opportunity to hear Sheena help us all dive deep into what drives the choices you make and how to use this power to your advantage at work and beyond. Her groundbreaking research has uncovered some surprising attitudes about our decisions. A very warm welcome to Dr. Iyengar, joining us today from New York.
Hello, everybody. Today, I want to talk about how we can use choice to write and create the story of our lives. As Joseph Campbell once said, everything begins with a story. So I'm going to start by telling you the story of my life. I was born in the midst of a giant blizzard in Toronto, Canada. My mother was all alone that night, as she had just recently immigrated from India to Canada, and my father was still trying to make his way over there to be with her. So here she was in a foreign country, all alone, with a newborn baby in her arms. I sometimes try to imagine what it must have been like for her that night. I imagine her standing next to the window with this newborn baby in her arms, staring at the snowflakes whirling around, wondering about the future of this child. Unbeknownst to her, the low visibility of that night, the absence of my father, would prove important for things to come. You see, at that moment of my birth, everything about my life was already known. All you had to do was read it in the stones or in the stars. At that moment of my birth, everything about my life had already been predetermined either by the hand of God or by some other unnameable force. And the only thing left for me to do now was to act out the text. So that is one story of my life. Now let me tell you another. Life is filled with surprises. It's a jack-in-the-box. You turn the crank slowly, one rotation at a time, but sometimes things just spring up and out unexpectedly. That's exactly what I decided to do. I sprang out 1 month earlier than I was supposed to, and my father couldn't even be there for my birth. My mother, who had never intended to leave India, found herself transported from India to Canada to New York City and now lives in a tiny little town in New Jersey. My parents were devout Sikhs. They brought with them their religion, and if there wasn't already a Sikh temple there, they created one. So I grew up going to the Sikh temple on Friday night, Saturday night, most of Sunday. I learned to practice the 5Ks and respect my elders. I knew that the best career option for a girl like me, growing up in this foreign country, was to be a doctor or an engineer. And of course, when the time was right, just like it had been done for my mother, a suitable boy would be chosen for me. So that was the plan. But we all know what happens to the best laid plans of mice and men. When I was a toddler, by then we were in New York City, my parents started to wonder why they had to constantly shout, "Watch out." Surely, even a klutz would notice a parking meter on occasion. The mystery was solved one day by a specialist here at Columbia University, which is where I teach today. The specialist told my parents that I had been born with a rare form of retinitis pigmentosa and that I would go blind sometime before I finished my school years. Well, You know the saying, right? That bad things only happen to the resilient. Then again, they also say that it is only when you have bad things happen to you that you become resilient. I've never been quite sure what's the truth. But even the resilient can have the wind knocked out of them. When I was 13, my father woke up one morning and he complained of leg pain. He was having trouble breathing. We all told him to go to the doctor, but later that day he was found collapsed on the streets of Manhattan, and by the time he got to the emergency room he had his third and final heart attack and was gone. Hearing my story, you might say that my life was solely filled with random and unpleasant events. And you might start asking the big questions that we all ask ourselves at different points in our life. How much can I really plan for my future when I can only see so far and when the weather can change faster than I might say surprise? So that is the second story of my life. Now I have a third story for you. And it is once again my story, but it is also the story of every single one of you, because if it wasn't, you wouldn't be in the position that you are in today. My parents chose to go to Canada. They chose to come to the United States. They were in search for a better life for themselves and for their children. My father used to boast that when he crossed that border into New York City, he had exactly $1 in his pocket, but he brought with him a lot of dreams. I was born into that dream, and perhaps as somebody growing up in the modern era, in a country that spoke of things like the American dream, I understood the lingua franca of that dream better than they did. And I understood that what shined so bright in the center of that dream that you could see it, even if you were blind like me, was choice. I could have seen my life in terms of fate. I could have seen my life in terms of chance. I chose to see my life in terms of what was still possible and what I could make happen. Take a look at these photos. I'm sure you recognize most, if not all, the people here. Whether you agree with the actions that they took, the philosophies they espoused, you'd have to acknowledge that they were all leaders. What made them leaders? People like Gandhi, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Steve Jobs. Can we imagine a world today without the likes of any of them and the ways in which they changed our world? Was it just fate? You know how some people are just born with this almost supernatural power to draw others to them. We call that charisma. Was it just chance? Serendipity, we might say. Sometimes people happen to be at the right place at the right time and are therefore given the opportunity to be leaders. Was it choice? They saw the problem. They recognized an opportunity to solve it. They acted on it, and that's what made all the difference. You and I can tell the story of the lives of any one of these leaders in terms of fate or chance or choice. And no matter how we tell the story of their lives, there would be an element of truth to it. Now think of your own lives. You are all in this amazing moment in your lives, in your professions. The world is your oyster. What were the circumstances of your birth that enabled you to be in this position today? What were those random encounters, those random things you came across that enabled you to be in the position that you are in today? And what were those choices that you made? Those critical choices. You know, if you answered all these three questions that I just gave you and really wrote it down and thought about it, you'll discover that the answers to each of those three questions is different. And you'll discover that each of those three answers teaches you something new about how it is you became who you are. And yet, there's something very special when you tell the story of your life in terms of choice. It is only when you tell the story of your life in terms of choice that it gives meaning to everything you say and do. In the end, choice is the only one of these forces that puts control in your hands. It is the only tool we have that enables us to go from who we are today to whom we want to be tomorrow. And it is therefore the most powerful tool we have for changing our futures and transforming the world around us. I'm going to take the next little time we have together and take a bright light on choice. And we're going to consider how we can get more out of this tool called choice. Take a look at these 4 questions. Really read them and ask yourself, what is the underlying belief of items 1 and 3, and what is the underlying belief of items 2 and 4? Items 1 and 3 are what we call a fixed mindset. It's the idea that my IQ, my abilities are fixed. I'm born being good at something, or not. It's called a fixed mindset. Items 2 and 4 are what we call a growth mindset. That's the idea that, whether I'm good or bad at something really depends on how much effort and practice I put into it. For the longest time, there was this real puzzle about why is it that women, when they're young, do better at math and science than boys, and then suddenly something happens that changes once they hit around 6th grade. Carol Dweck, this famous psychologist who wrote the book Mindset, spent some time examining the way teachers interact with girls and boys in elementary school. And what she observed was that teachers just naturally interacted with girls and boys differently. So that, when girls are little, they're neat and they're organized and they do what they're told. And so the teacher would look at their homework and say, oh my goodness, you're so smart, you're so neat, you're so good. Boys, on the other hand, can't sit still. They're constantly getting into fights, throwing spitballs. And so what would the teacher say to them? Oh my God, will you just settle down? If only you would concentrate. Just imagine what you could do in life. So suddenly, when they're in 7th grade and the tests get harder, what happened? The gender gap appeared. And so Dr. Dweck asked the fundamental question, is it really gender differences as a function of what girls and boys are good at, or is there something else going on here? And what she discovered is that when people have a more fixed mindset, believe they're either good or bad at something, the moment things get hard, you quit. But those who have a growth mindset, meaning you believe that as long as you put the effort in, you can get better and better and better at it. Those are the people that actually outperform on tests in the long run. And it turned out that subconsciously teachers were giving girls different messages about intelligence than they were giving it to boys. So girls came to believe that maybe they weren't so good anymore because they were no longer being told, oh, you're so smart, you're so good, now that their test scores were going down a little. Whereas boys were thinking, okay, it's getting hard now, maybe I need to start paying attention. Once you started to train kids to have a growth mindset, the gender differences disappear. In fact, when you look at the Fortune 500 companies, those companies who are more likely to endorse views of a growth mindset see increased performance amongst their employees, greater innovation amongst their employees, and greater employee commitment. So my first tip, above all else, see choosing not as something inborn. It's a skill that you want to develop. Now, how do you develop this skill called choosing, right? You're doing it all the time, day in, day out. How do we get better at it? Some people have probably told you about the 10,000 hour rule that was made famous by Malcolm Gladwell's book Outliers. It all got started by this one study with musicians. Musicians who practice 2,000 hours become great amateurs, and 5,000 hours become teachers, and 10,000 hours, and you can become a professional musician performing at the likes of Carnegie Hall. And that's been shown to be true whether you're looking at people becoming surgeons or programmers, all kinds of skills. But is it just doing practice? Is that enough? Let's look at 2 sets of kids. Young kids, about 6 years old, and they have to take a test. And on the day of the test, they have to pick up a beanbag and they have to throw it in a bucket that's exactly 2 feet away. Now, one set of kids to prepare for this day of D-Day, the day of test. They come in every day, they pick up the beanbag, they throw it in the bucket that's exactly 2 feet away, and they do this day after day after day. The second group of kids come into the room, they pick up the beanbag, they throw it in the bucket. The bucket keeps moving. Sometimes it's 1 feet away, sometimes it's 10 feet away, sometimes it's 5 feet away, sometimes it's 25 feet away. Which group of kids do better? In the second group, those kids never got to put the beanbag in a bucket that was 2 feet away. But on the day of the test, they had to throw it into a bucket that was exactly 2 feet away. And what happens? It's actually the second group of kids that do way better. Because even though they never got to experience throwing the beanbag into the bucket that was exactly 2 feet away, they learned so many patterns. Each time they have to focus. Oh my goodness, the bucket's moved. How do I throw the beanbag in? What do I need to do? They're learning strategies. They're experimenting. They're learning patterns. In fact, it turns out that when you teach people how to do math in this way, where you don't know the order in which the questions might appear, algebra, calculus, geometry, it turns out that if you learn in a way where you don't know what's coming, you're constantly experimenting and figuring out, well, what do I need to do now? And what do I need to do at this point? You're developing the skill of learning the different patterns. Your ability to become a great chooser is not coming from you doing something over and over and over again in the same way. It comes from doing it in lots of different ways because what you're doing is you're learning patterns. You're only as good as the number of patterns that you know. As the Nobel Prize winner Herb Simon once said, intuition is nothing more and nothing less than pattern recognition. And so for my second tip, in order to get the most from choice, you have to practice strategically, not in a habitual way. Now, I want you to think very carefully about my next question. I really want you to, on a piece of paper, really think this through. How many choices do you make in a given week? I want you over the next few days to really keep track, because you're making lots of choices, right? Lots of professional choices, personal choices, all kinds of random choices. And I want you to really keep that log. Because one of the things that's happened in our modern lives is there has been a real explosion of choice. All kinds of choice, like consumer choices. For example, the average grocery store in the United States in the 1970s had 9,000 products in it. Today it has over 40,000 products. And even that's like small potatoes. I mean, you go to Walmart, it's upwards of 30 million products. You go to Amazon, it's upward of 300 million products. Starbucks gives you 87,000 different drink combinations. And we're really talking like little choices where these are concerned, right? We're talking just, what we're going to consume, like eat, drink, read a book, clothes. We have choices today about things that, our parents never heard of, like going online to find dating options, right? There are 5,000 different dating sites now in the world. And it's not just consumer choices, it's also the amount of information that we have to process today. It is now estimated that the amount of information that professional adults have to consume on a daily basis, like the amount of information coming at you, consciously and unconsciously per day, is the equivalent of reading 147 newspapers. We check our cell phones an average of 150 times a day. Just think of all the information, all the choices that you're making. So, I did a study many years ago that looked at the consequences of offering people too much choice. I'm going to give you one very simple study. Imagine in a grocery store we have a jam aisle. We have a tasting booth that has jams. And we either put out 6 different flavors of jam or 24 different flavors of jam. And now I look at 2 things. First, in which case are people more likely to sample some jam? And second, in which case are people more likely to buy a jar of jam? It turned out that more people stopped when there were 24 on display as compared to when there were 6, 60% versus 40%. But when it came down to buying, of the people who encountered 24, only 3% of them bought. Of the people who encountered 6, 30% of them bought a jar of jam. This study came out in the year 2000. And since then, there's been hundreds of studies that have been looking at the consequences of offering people choice across many domains. And essentially what we find is that even though we want more choice, the more choices we have leads us to, run into some problems. We're more likely to procrastinate or choose not to choose. We're more likely to make errors in our decisions. We're more likely to be dissatisfied with what we have chosen. Why is this? Well, our brains are limited. If I ask you to rank order from best to worst a whole bunch of things on how much you like them or how good they are beyond about 7 plus or minus 2, I can't keep track. Relatedly, if I ask you to keep track of information, words, numbers, pictures, and I don't give you an opportunity to memorize that information beyond about 7 plus or minus 2, that information starts to crumble away. It's known as the magical number 7 plus or minus 2. Think about your lives. You have so many choices, and you want to start thinking about what are the choices that really matter, that are really good for you to pursue. You have so much potential, and you're not going to be good at everything. There was a wonderful study done on CEOs where they tracked them for a week. And they found that, on average, these CEOs are engaging in about 137 different tasks, roughly about 5 decisions per task. Over 50% of the decisions they made in 9 minutes or less. Only about 12% of the decisions did they dedicate an hour or more of their time. You need to ask yourself every day, are the right things making it into your 9-minute versus your 1-hour category? Because trust me, you're going to be making more decisions than even a CEO. The last thing I want to talk about today as to how do we really get the most from choice is something I call the personal strategy map. So I already told you, pay attention to what's making it in your to-do list and how are you going to do that? It's called the personal strategy map. It's something I do with the MBA students. And I want all of you to do this as your homework. So you have 3 columns. On the left-hand column, you put your possible passions. All the things you really care about. And you can make that list as long as you can. Most people have somewhere between 3 to 10. On the right-handmost column, you put your possible goals. Well, I want to be head of the, IT, for example. Or I want to create a brand new product. Okay? Make those goals, dream big. Now, notice how the middle column is filled with question marks. And you're going to leave it as question marks until you see the answer. So it's important every year to come up with your possible passions and your possible goals. I do this myself every year. And then what I do is I pick 1, maybe 2 at max. What really matters to me? I really want to make progress on this. And so now what I do is I do something called idea networking. This is where I ask myself, look, I'm really interested in becoming great at IT, for example. Let me find somebody who's either in IT or knows somebody in IT, and I don't ask them, is this a good idea for me to become good at IT? No. They don't know anyway. Their opinion doesn't count. The only thing you need to ask them is, hey, do you know someone I can talk to about how they became good at IT? That's it. You're getting advice. You're getting knowledge. And you keep asking people, how did you do it? How have other people done it? What you're doing is collecting ways in which people have done it. And once you see a way to do something that is feasible for you, that fills in the question mark. That becomes the opportunity that's yours. So when you network with other people, you're collecting advice. You're not collecting opinions. You're collecting advice on how they have done it or how they have seen others do it or if they know somebody else who has done it. And every week, make it a point to find 2 people that you can talk to that can give you advice. If you make that habit little by little, you will be filling those question marks. But only do 1 or 2 at a time, otherwise it's overwhelming. And pick the one that's most important for you, meaning it gives you the greatest value added. You have limited time. And you want to get the most from that time, most from your choosing energy. So, for my third tip today, I want all of you to create your personal strategy map. You know, growing up, I, like most of us, used to think that if I just waited around or thought enough about it, the right choice would come along and I would know what I could do. I used to think that choice would just hit you like a truth. And then I realized one day that the power of choice does not come from our ability to pick. It comes from our ability to create. As the great French polymath Henri Poincaré once said, invention consists of avoiding the constructing of useless combinations, and consists of the constructing of useful combinations, which are an infinite minority. To invent is to discern, to choose. Allow me to propose a corollary to you, which is to choose is to invent. That the real power in your lives comes from your ability to construct those most meaningful choices for yourself. So, I want to end with a not so humble request of you. Don't be afraid to lead. Don't be afraid to create. Remember that the modern hero is no longer the chosen one, but the one who chooses. She is self-made. That is, she has made herself through her choices because choosing is not just an act of self-expression, but an act of creation. And it is as you make a few careful choices, day in, day out, that you transform your lives and the world around you. And this is how we become our most beautiful and singular selves. Thank you very much.
Fascinating, absolutely fascinating, incredibly thought-provoking, and inspirational to say the least, Sheena. Thank you very much for that. It makes everyone, certainly me for sure, pause for a minute and wonder about all the decisions we have made today, if not more. If you don't mind, I'm going to pick up on a topic that you addressed here, the personal strategy map. And you kind of came there from the whole growth mindset. But if I go back to your book, and I've read it a few times now, if I go back to your book and think about the spectrum of individualism and collectivism, and then the notion of identity, the question that comes in my mind is, as we go through this creating the personal strategy map, are there hindrances that appear because we bring that baggage of identity and collectivism to the table? Are there any watch outs that you'd recommend as we build our own strategy map?
That's a great question. It's funny you asked that question too, because that was certainly one of the personal struggles that I certainly had growing up as an Indian American. Because, you know, as an American, I was constantly told, you know, you can just ask yourself, what do you want? And, you know, you could do whatever you want. And there was nothing to stop you. And yet that didn't quite seem that true. But still, I was told you could do whatever you want. On the other hand, in the Indian household, if I said to my mom, well, look, I can do whatever I want, my mom would be like, what do you mean you can do whatever you want? You have duties, you have responsibilities, you can't just do whatever you want, right? And so essentially, the two cultures gave me two seemingly opposing messages, right? Because one said that choice was all about possibilities, and those possibilities were endless. And on the other side, I'm taught about the fact that choice actually has limitations. And for the longest time, I used to think that I had to pick one of those two ways of thinking about choice. I then had this realization at a certain point that, you know what, this wasn't actually a choice between one or the other, that in reality, these were two sides of the same coin. Mm-hmm. That in fact, if you want to get the most from choice, you have to be able to think about all the possibilities, but do so with a clear-eyed understanding of what the limitations are. And so when I had that understanding, I began to realize that you can't ask the question, what do you want? You also can't ask the question, well, what do my parents want and what does society want for me? That neither one of those is particularly in the long run helpful. What you want to be able to ask yourself is, where's my greatest value added? Meaning, what can I do that I would want, but is also that which fulfills, what would be good for the others, whoever those others might be. And when you find that sweet spot, that's actually usually when you make some of your greatest choices. And so if you think of that personal strategy map, in a sense, that personal strategy map embodies what I've just said. So notice what I said. I said you go from passion to goal only when the opportunity presents itself. And it's only when you see the path that's doable that you do it. Now, of course, I also said that you're constantly searching. You're not just waiting around for it to be handed to you. You are constantly searching. But yes, you act when those pieces are able to come together in a nice alignment.
Fantastic. I believe some questions are coming in the chat. I think Gauri is kind of asking, how do I validate my choice? How do I know it's right or wrong?
Well, there's lots of choices where you're not entirely sure if you're right or wrong. And about the only time you will know is with time. We often are told that if you want to make a really big choice, you should either, follow your heart or the gut, so to speak, or we're told to do a reasoned analysis, right? Do your pros and cons list and figure out what are the positives, what are the negatives. The truth is that neither of those pieces of advice are actually good for you. They both leave value on the table. If you just follow your heart knows how to answer the question, what do you want right now? But it doesn't know what it wants in 5 minutes or in a month or in 10 years from now. The pros and cons list tells you what you should want, what you ought to choose, but it doesn't actually tell you what you will want to choose and how you will feel about it if it actually comes out the way it should come out. So essentially what you really want to be doing when you make a choice to sort of increase your odds is it should be a choice where you're generating multiple options that are potential solutions to what you want, and then you pick the one that's most in line with what you want. So essentially, you are trying to balance your heart and with what makes sense to do. Now, that's not easy to do, which is why choosing is such a effortful exercise. But if you're able to find a choice where both your heart and your mind are aligned, just choose it. That happens very rarely in life. Just choose it. And even if it doesn't work out, what you're essentially going to be able to do is be able to, so when you make a choice, it's not as if you've just made this choice and it's done, right? That's all you're doing is making a choice to make many, many, many more choices that follow this choice. But if your heart and mind are aligned, you will be better motivated and equipped to keep making those choices day in, day out to make that choice work out.
Fantastic. Heart and mind alignment. Brilliant. I think there's a question from the audience. Alpa Bansal from the Machani group. Do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. Sheena, thanks for this power-packed session. I wish we had more time because there's so much to think about every little capsule that you've given us. Question is, while we're making these choices, somewhere we change, so the you changes. Can you give us an example when you've recalibrated your choices and the world around you with both grace and intention?
So Here's the trick behind that. So when you're making a really big choice, you make it in a way that not only enables you, I mean, of course, if it's a big choice, as we said, it has to be heart and mind aligned. That doesn't mean it's going to work out, but you make it in a way that enables you to keep growing. So, for example, what would I say was one of the best choices I ever made? I would say, no pun intended, the best choice I ever made was the choice to study choice. Mm-hmm. And what was it that made that choice so great? It was that you never run out of interesting questions that you can study that relate to choice. It's like a bottomless well. And the more you dig deeper, the more you learn, right? And so to the extent possible, when you are making those really big choices, you want to find and frame your choices in that way. Often what we have a nasty habit of doing, and in part this is because the way, others frame choices for us, the way marketing is done for choices, often people will frame choices as if it's yes or no, right? Do this job or not, go to the city and live there or not, get married or not, you name it, every aspect of your life. Invariably, people frame it as yes or no. Avoid that trap. The moment something is framed that way, step back and ask yourself, wait a second, what is my true underlying desire? Not, is this choice worthy or not? What is my underlying desire? Because once you think in terms of your underlying desire, that's when you will come up with the multiple paths to achieve it. And that's what you want to do. So yes, on the one hand, I told you, limit your choices. But the reason why I tell you to limit your choices, because on those choices that really matter, you need to have the mental energy it takes to be able to generate alternatives. The power of choice doesn't come from picking. It comes from your ability to generate those choices. And that's what I mean by that. Stepping back and saying, well, what is my underlying desire? And saying, okay, well, if that's what my desire is, what are the different ways I can achieve it?
Fantastic.
Great, thank you.
But I mean, I guess another answer to your question is sure, I've made some choices that didn't work out as well, and you do your best, right? As much as you can, you do your best. And then when it doesn't work, sometimes you have to have the courage to say it's not working.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Wonderful response. And I think you covered a question that we had earlier from Zuneta Rizwana, and this is about what made you choose your academic career. And I think that question is also answered well. Thank you. If I take you back to the notion of growth mindset that you kind of spoke about, Professor Iyengar, the people who might turn around and say, I don't belong to that. Do you think it's possible for them to break those old patterns and switch?
Say that again. So they have a growth mindset, and what are the patterns?
If they believe they're not the growth mindset naturally, they're more the fixed mindset. People identify that way. Then is it possible for them to make the switch?
Well, I mean, if you think about it, that's a big part of Indian parenting, right? I mean, how much energy Indian parents constantly put into their kids when their kids don't do well in a certain test, etc. What do parents automatically say? You didn't study hard enough, and you get yelled at about that. What are they essentially communicating? They're communicating, maybe not the most pleasant way every time, but a growth mindset. Put in the effort, and you better work hard, and then you'll get there, right? Children don't always believe it, right? They have to hear it over and over and over again, and then it might sink in. And the same thing is true for adults. It's harder as we become adults because, we're less malleable.
Indeed. And before we move into the last question.
As a company, though, you can create incentives, right? Mm-hmm. So that as a company, if you incentivize experimentation, mm-hmm. then that allows people to at least sample some growth mindset. If they think the penalty for failing is going to be too high, then they won't experiment.
Excellent. So before we move to the last question for the day, we'd love to hear from all of you, the audience, on how useful you found today's session. There's a link on the chat that's coming up, so please do share your views there. And with that, come into the last question. Since all of us have an imposter syndrome, and women are no different, have you personally questioned your choices, Sheena?
Say a little more about this imposter syndrome.
It, I think, goes back to the notion of identity and individualism, if you may, where you believe you're not part of, or you're not in the right place, you're just lucky to have it, and most probably somebody will figure out that you shouldn't be there, and they'll kind of take you out. So it's a bit of the ambition stretching and getting you a new goal. So your thoughts around that?
I mean, that's a great question. So we are all given narratives, and we often are trapped in those narratives. And that's easy for me to say. It's not easy for any of us to discover our narratives. So, for example, I told you my own personal story, right? There's certainly lots of narratives about a blind person, right, growing up. And, and every culture has its own narratives, which are not particularly positive about somebody growing up blind. And it does take a conscious effort to decide that you want to refute that narrative, right? So in my case, I remember when I was very young, certainly one of the things that, as a kid of Indian parents, my parents thought that one of the solutions would be, okay, they get really rich and find me a rich husband, and then I'll be taken care of. Now, maybe you could have said I was an imposter to want to do well at school and to want to try to become somebody that could educate the world. In some sense, you could say that was being an imposter. Or in some sense, you could say, well, look, what was I doing? I was trying to create a new narrative. And so I think that when we hear phrases like fake it until you make it, the key to that is not faking it for the sake of being inauthentic or becoming something that you're not, or pretending to be something that you're not. That advice is about asking you, can you imagine yourself having a different narrative? And if you can imagine yourself having a different narrative, then can you experiment with that and try out a different role? And you may discover when you try out that different role that it doesn't suit you. It doesn't work. Or you may discover that when you try out that different narrative and you try out this new skill, that there's potential. And that's how you use it to help you out. But are you going to feel at times that you're incompetent and not worthy of doing X? Sure, we all do. And all you have to do at that moment is say, okay, well, what do I need to know to be able to do better at this so that I'm not an imposter? You don't have to buy into feeling that you're not worthy.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Sheena. You made us notice that choice is inevitable, but one can look at patterns and make more informed choices in the future. Thank you very much, Sheena, for joining us today, and to all our wonderful participants for being here and part of this incredible story sharing session. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Good luck.